Hello, my name is Talib Küçükcan. I welcome you on behalf of the TRT World Forum Digital Debates. This week, we are going to debate the implications of the rise and fall of the Arab Spring. It's been almost a decade since the beginning of the Arab Spring, and there are lots of implications regionally and also country-wise. Today, we are going to look at the reasons behind it and what happened and what will happen, what sort of implications it will have in the future. Our guest is Professor Shadi Hamid, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings institutions. Shadi, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having
Before
me.
we begin our discussion, let me introduce you to our audience. Dr. Shadi Hamid is a senior fellow at the Brookings institutions and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. He is the author of many books, actually. He's a prolific writer. He is the author of Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, and co-editor of Rethinking Political Islam. His first book, Temptations of Power, Islamists and Illiberal Democracy in the Middle East, was named a Foreign Affairs Best Book of 2014. Hamid was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers by the Prospect magazine in 2019. He received his BSc and MA from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and his PhD in political science from Oxford University. Shadi, again, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here. Let's begin with the Arab Spring. What were the main reasons that really produced such a massive movement in the Arab world?
Yeah, well, so, first of all, authoritarianism has been a distinct problem in the Middle East. I mean, if you look at other regions, there were real improvements in political reform and democratization in parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America. But the one exception to this, more or less, was the Middle East, where we didn't see really any opening of political space. If anything, these regimes were getting more repressive. So the Mubarak regime in Egypt, for example, during the 2000s, in the lead up to the Arab Spring, had become more repressive. And I remember the last election that Egypt had before the Arab Spring, which was in the fall of 2010, was one of the most fraudulent in Egyptian history. So we saw this very negative trajectory, and the frustration had been building over a period of time. And I'm someone who believes that repression can last forever. Authoritarian regimes can't keep on being authoritarian. They can last for quite some time, but there comes a breaking point. Now, it's hard to predict what the breaking point is, and that's why the Arab Spring caught a lot of observers off guard. But it's a question of when and not if. So there's the lack of freedom, the lack of political reform, and also the fact that many of these regimes were not delivering on economic terms. Now, their GDP was going up, their GDP per capita was increasing significantly, and there were accolades from the World Bank and other international financial institutions. And that especially was the case in Tunisia and Egypt. They actually experienced some of the most impressive growth they had in the 2000s. But the problem was that those economic gains were not shared throughout society. It was very top-heavy, where you saw a small sliver of economic and political elites who were enjoying these benefits, but there wasn't a real redistributive policy. And actually, in the middle class and the poor, you actually saw their quality of life getting worse. So the gap between the haves and have-nots was actually growing, in spite of the fact that some of the overall economic data was looking better. And that's why we have to be careful, like even going forward, that there are different economic indicators that we should look at, and it's not just a question of overall GDP.
Right. Actually, when we look at the Arab Spring back, there are two views. One view is that this is a nativist movement that emerged in the Middle East, in the Arab world, because of the demand for transparency, accountability, and for good governance, etc. But some argue that that's a sort of a conspiracy theory. That is sort of a not a natural movement, but it was motivated by by other countries or other forces. How do you see these two opposing views?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely this discourse that the West was involved in promoting this, and there are conspiracy theories about the CIA and God knows who else that was promoting instability. I mean, that's also a line that these regimes wanted to promote, and they would always say things like there are foreign hands involved, that there are these nefarious forces that are trying to destabilize Egypt. I mean, that was a big one of the big narratives that we saw in the early days of the Arab Spring, but there's very little evidence of that. And it's also a weird claim to make that Western intelligence services wanted this to happen, because as we know, the US has not had a great history of supporting democracy in the Middle East. If anything, the US and other Western powers have been an obstacle to democratization because they actually were quite comfortable with having these authoritarian regimes in power, because it was easy to deal with someone like Mubarak. He was a known quantity. Democracy is uncertain. Democracy is good, but it's also risky because you're not dealing with one dictator at the top. You're dealing with different competing interests, different bureaucracies, different institutions. And so you don't always know what a democratic government is going to do. But with Mubarak, you know, you have one phone number that you call, you talk to him, you get things done. And that's the case today to some extent with Sisi in Egypt, who, and we can get to this later, who is more authoritarian than Mubarak could ever have hoped to be. So then later on in the Arab Spring, we see some more conspiracy theories that the US and the Obama administration in particular were trying to support the Muslim Brotherhood and propel them to power, which was also an odd conspiracy theory because, as we know, the US has never been comfortable with Islamist parties coming to power through free elections. That's one of the reasons we as Americans have always been very hesitant about democracy in the Middle East, because we are afraid that Islamist movements, specifically Brotherhood affiliates in different countries, will come to power, and the Brotherhood makes us nervous. We don't know how to deal with them. We're not comfortable dealing with them. And sometimes we see their ideology as a threat.
Then do you believe that the people who went onto the streets for democracy, for better governance, for welfare, for equality, for the rule of law, they were left alone by the West?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's interesting now to look back. It's been almost 10 years now since the Arab Spring started. And I should actually note that I was in Tahrir Square the day that Mubarak fell. So February 11th, 2011. And I remember being in the square and the announcement came that Mubarak was resigning. And then the crowd just erupts in joy and cheers. And at first they couldn't even process it because it was an amazing thing. You dream about it, but to actually see it happening in real time. And, you know, it was one of those once in a lifetime beautiful moments. But when I look back at that level of optimism, there's also a sense of sadness, because ever since that moment in 2011, things really went downhill, as we know, in a number of different ways. And I think a big part of that story is that the Western powers, and specifically the Obama administration, didn't play a constructive role. There was this early period where the Obama administration was saying the right things, and there seemed to be some pressure on the Egyptian military to undergo a democratic transition, but it didn't last. And you could always tell that Obama himself was a little bit torn, that he wanted to show that he was supporting these new movements, but he was also a very cautious president. And he was worried that too much democracy would mean too much instability and too much uncertainty, because you don't know who's going to win. You don't know what to expect. And so when people say that the Arab Spring failed, I would respond and say the Arab Spring didn't have to fail, there are other alternative scenarios and counterfactual histories where it could have turned out better. So, for example, the military coup in Egypt that happened in July 2013 that ended Egypt's democratic experiment, did that have to happen? Or was that one of several scenarios? So, I mean, at the end of the day, individuals, countries, the US government has agency. And if different choices were made at different key moments, we might have seen different and more positive outcomes. And I'm also of the view that the Obama administration, if it acted more seriously and aggressively in the lead up to the July 2013 military coup, there was a chance that we as Americans could have stopped that from happening if we put more pressure on the Egyptian military and sent a very clear message to say that if there is an overthrow of the freely elected government, that there would be consequences in the US-Egypt relationship. But what we know from the reporting that came afterwards is that the Secretary of Defense at the time, Chuck Hagel, didn't actually send a very clear signal to the Egyptian military. And that's why I would argue the Egyptian regime felt they could get away with the coup, because they knew that the US wouldn't be thrilled about it, but they also knew that we probably wouldn't push very hard against it. And that's precisely what happened. After the coup, as many viewers will recall, the US wasn't even comfortable calling it a coup. And in August 2013, John Kerry, who was Secretary of State at the time, actually commended the Egyptian military for restoring democracy. So there were a lot of negative signals that I think encouraged the Egyptian military to become more repressive. And we saw more repression, and it continues to this very day.
So I think that was a missed opportunity or missed moment as far as promotion of democracy in the Middle East is concerned, because the West in general and the US in particular, when you look at the discourse and rhetoric, they always argue that they would like to see more democratization. It seems that has not happened in the Middle East. Now let's look at the legacy of the Arab Spring. If you look at individual countries, there are different, I think, legacies, I would say. Tunisia and Syria are at the maybe opposing poles of the countries that we can mention. What are the short-term, medium-term, and long-term legacies that we can see as far as Arab Spring and its implications are concerned?
Well, so as you mentioned, I mean, Tunisia is one of the bright spots. So it's not all depressing. There are some things that we can point to and say, Tunisia's not perfect. It has major flaws. They have experienced any number of struggles, but at least their democratic transition is continuing. And I think at the center of their relative success is the fact that they figured out a way to deal with ideological polarization. So in a number of Arab countries, including Egypt, you had a profound divide between Islamists and non-Islamists. And they disagreed, the different sides disagreed on the most fundamental questions, the role of religion in everyday life, the relationship between Islam and the state, the role of Sharia. These are very existential things that are very personal because they relate to religion and what elicits stronger reactions than one's relationship to God and so on. What was promising about Tunisia, though, is that Islamists and secularists were able to both find compromises and work together in coalition governments. And they were able to draft a constitution where Ennahda, the main Islamist party in Tunisia, was willing to make real concessions and say, well, we don't need to have explicit Sharia provisions in the constitution. And they prioritized the transition. And they said, we're willing to back down because we want this transition to succeed. So that's one positive way of looking at it, is that sometimes you have to make compromises even if you don't want to. And to this day, we've seen a number of coalition governments where you've had Ennahda along with secular parties that traditionally don't like Islamists and have seen Islamists as a threat, but they've been together in the same government. And that's where Egypt failed, as we know, because both sides were not able to coexist. And I think one of the reasons that we see this divergence is that in Egypt, Islamists were too strong. The Brotherhood got about 40 to 45% of the vote. Then you had Salafis, ultra-conservatives, getting 20 to 27% of the vote. So in that sense, Islamists were much stronger, which didn't leave enough room for non-Islamist forces to have representation. In Tunisia, it was more of a 50-50 kind of situation, which made it a little bit more balanced. We should also, as mentioned, one of the worst case scenarios, which is Syria. And that's what happens when not only do you have the failure of democracy, but you have something worse, which is the outbreak of political violence, civil conflict, and even civil war. And I would put Libya, Yemen, and Syria in the category of the countries that fell to civil war and in some sense are facing, some version of civil conflict to this very day. And that's a big question about what could have turned out differently there. I'm of the view that the Obama administration made a major and really a fatal mistake in not intervening more aggressively against the Assad regime. And now we see the Assad regime having effectively won the civil war. And I think it'll take Syrians decades, an entire generation to recover from this, if they ever really recover from this. And one reason is that the international community failed to step in and protect Syrian civilians from the killing of the Syrian regime. And we're talking obviously now about significantly more than 500,000. I mean, we lost track and international organizations stopped keeping track of the numbers, but we do know that it's more than 500,000. So this brings us back to the whole question of if we have democratic transitions in other countries in 10 years and 20 years, we have to learn from those mistakes and we have to say, let's not repeat this international failure that happened in the critical moments of 2011 to 2015. And I think that was a real tragedy. And of course, I think a lot of international observers, they say, if only we could have the Obama administration instead of the Trump administration, which I generally agree with. But at the same time, we have to be honest about the very critical failures that the Obama administration was responsible for. And we shouldn't just forget about those because of what we see now being worse, which is the Trump administration. We have to be honest and objective in looking at how different administrations have had different weaknesses. And some of those weaknesses have been quite destructive.
Shadi, thank you very much for this excellent, let's say, explanation as far as the legacy is concerned. But what would be your reaction to those people? Because you mentioned 3 countries, the Arab Spring have taken into, the crisis, let's say, fallen into a crisis, conflict, etc. Yemen, Libya, and Syria in particular. People, started to promote the idea of authoritarian stability in the Middle East. When you have this, democratization issues, you have got instability, conflict, etc. What would be your response to these people?
Well, we know, so the case, for example, of Libya and Syria, so a lot of people are saying if only we had stuck with the Assad regime, if only we had let the Gaddafi regime stay and not intervene. But what these people are missing is that the very reason that there were mass protests before any foreign intervention, and I mean, it was Libyans themselves who were taking to the streets against Gaddafi, and they were being gunned down in cold blood. There was no militarization of the Syrian uprising until towards the end of 2011. In the first few months, these were largely peaceful demonstrations. So this shows that authoritarian regimes don't provide stability because people, at some point, if you believe that there's something about the human spirit that desires, and not just desires, but requires some level of freedom and dignity and self-worth and self-determination, they're not going to accept living under the brutal repression of Gaddafi or Assad indefinitely. And that's why they took to the streets. And I guarantee that this will happen again in other countries, that for now, they might seem stable. But the problem with authoritarian stability is that it's an illusion. It seems stable until it's not, and then it's too late. And sometimes these regimes, they lull us into a sense of security. So for example, now we talk about Egypt under Sisi and we say, oh, it looks very stable. Sisi is ruling with an iron fist, and that may be true for 5 years or for 10 years. But do we really believe that the Egyptian people are going to accept these extremely high levels of repression forever? And this is why I've always been an advocate of saying US policymakers need to think ahead for the moment when democratic openings start to happen, for when mass uprisings start to happen, because we thought that things were stable in 2010. I remember actually a professor friend of mine, he was telling me that right before the Arab Spring in 2010, he would always ask his students to predict which Arab regime is most likely to face mass uprisings. And out of about 200 of his students, 0 out of 200 said Tunisia. But Tunisia was the first country that experienced a mass uprising at the end of 2010 going into early 2011. So it's a reminder for us as observers and analysts to be modest. Even if things seem impossible now and we can't imagine that there could be real change, things can happen very quickly in this region, and we shouldn't forget about that. And we should prepare for the time when there will be protests, unless, of course, you believe that authoritarian regimes can do this for the next 40 or 50 years. But we know that this has not actually been the case in any part of the world. Wherever there has been an authoritarian regime, there have always been mass protests where people say enough is enough. Now, we don't know when, and this is where a lot of the uncertainty comes in. We don't know when these mass protests break out. But as I said earlier, it's a question of when, not if.
Shadi, you are closely following the political movements and parties in the region for many, many years, and also after the Arab Spring. Now, what is the state of political opposition in the Arab world today? Do Islamist movements still hold the front and center role, or have others risen to take the opposition mantle? Because in some countries, I think the Islamic movements were outlawed.
Yeah. So I think, unfortunately, and it pains me to say this, very high levels of repression can be effective. Like I said, they won't be effective forever, but they can be effective for the short to medium term. So today in Egypt, Egyptians are so afraid of what the regime might do to them. So there's very little incentive to speak out. There's very little incentive to go to a protest, because if it seems so hopeless and you don't know, and the protests are still relatively small, a lot of Egyptians may ask themselves, why should I put my own life and my own family at risk for a small protest, right? So fear is very powerful. So when people, you might recall that when the Arab Spring started, people would say things like, the wall of fear has been broken. Arabs now are confident that change is possible. But what we have learned is that fear can be reintroduced into the equation very quickly. And fear, I think, is the dominant emotion now, that people don't have hope that change is possible. And they're afraid of experiencing, we're going to prison, of their neighbors informing on them. And this is a problem that we've had in countries like Egypt and Syria, where even what you say to your own family in the privacy of your own home, you still might worry that someone could tell your employer or the local authorities that, look, this friend or this relative, be careful about him or her, because they are speaking ill of the Sisi regime or the Assad regime. So we've reached these very high levels. And that's why I think sometimes repression can be effective. Now, when it comes to Islamist parties, which are the major opposition, which have been traditionally, we see another problem here, that they've become very fragmented and internally divided. So in Egypt, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood has become very weak under the repression of the Sisi regime. And there's now effectively a split in the Brotherhood between two factions, and they're not getting along, and there's a lot of recrimination back and forth. And there have been efforts to mediate between the two factions, but those have failed. So, normally you would say if there is a strong opposition, maybe they could, help organize activities or protests. And it's not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but also if you had Islamist movements working with liberal and secular movements. But the problem is they don't get along still. 7 years after the military coup, we still see a major divide within the opposition camp, where liberals don't trust Islamists and Islamists don't trust liberals. They haven't been able to get over the mutual distrust from the Arab Spring period. So that's one thing that Sisi has been able to benefit, is that the opposition is fractured in any number of ways. And we see this not just in Egypt, but in a number of countries, that the opposition has become weakened. Now, this can change over time, but it's up to opposition groups to find ways to close the gap and to come up with some level of opposition unity, because we know from the literature, academic literature on democratic transitions, that if opposition movements are fractured, democratic transitions become much more challenging.
Shadi, you have briefly, I think, made reference to lessons to be learned from the past experience, Arab Spring in the beginning, the midterm and the end of it. Do you think that the regimes, the current regimes in the region, drew some lessons from the Arab Spring? Because you said that you actually strongly argue that authoritarianism may be here today, but it is not going to last forever. And some countries seems to be initiating, sort of reforms, but I don't know how strong these reforms are in terms of meeting the demands of the public.
Yeah, so I think there's one model of reform that we've seen in the sort of soft authoritarian cases like Jordan and Morocco, where there has been some constitutional reform. They haven't completely banned the opposition. There is still some parliamentary competition. But, and that might actually be a model. It's not a model that I like personally, because it doesn't actually necessarily get us closer to true democracy. It's actually a way of avoiding deeper reforms, because you give people a little bit and you say, hey, here are some reforms, live with that and stop complaining, right? But at least it can help it can actually continue for the time being. The problematic cases are the much more repressive ones. And the lessons that they've learned from the Arab Spring is don't give any ground. If there is opposition or if there's protests, don't make concessions to the opposition, because they point to Mubarak and they say, or Ben Ali in Tunisia, and they say, look, Mubarak was too soft. He was making these speeches and talking about trying to address the concerns of the youth. And so when we look at countries like Saudi Arabia or Egypt under Sisi, they're saying that you can't give any ground. You can't start making concessions, because if you do, the opposition will ask for more and they'll never be satisfied. And that's unfortunately one of the negative developments, is that regimes have more of a toolkit. They're smarter when it comes to how they suppress any kind of opposition or mass protests. And that's, I think, part of what we're seeing now. And if you look also at the regional dynamic, Saudi Arabia, and I would also argue the United Arab Emirates, have been very careful and very, I would say, aggressive in trying to keep the Egyptian regime as authoritarian as possible, because they're saying to Sisi, don't give any ground to the opposition. Don't try to reach out to certain elements, because once you do that, you'll get yourself back in a situation like the one Mubarak had. And we know what happened to Mubarak. Mubarak fell. It's only the strong that survive. So I think that is the new approach in much of the region, with the exception of these middle options of Morocco and Jordan. But the question is, how long can you last being in the middle? Yeah.
Right. I was going to ask about the lessons to be learned by the political parties, opposition parties, or the Islamic movements. Do you think that they also got their lessons? Because they had some, experience, especially in Egypt, for example. The Muslim Brotherhood had, although it's a short period of time, they were governing the country. They were also criticized later on. How do they now look at what they have done and what they could have done better? Whether there's any kind of self-assessment?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple lessons that if you talk to different members of the Brotherhood, they'll tell you. One is they shouldn't have allowed the military to play a central role in the transition. That many of the younger, more revolutionary-minded Brotherhood activists, they say, we should have never left Tahrir Square. We shouldn't have given things over to the military and say, because if you recall, there was the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, also known as SCAF, and they're the ones who managed the transition in 2011 and 2012. But now we know that they were never serious about giving up true power. They always wanted to keep a certain amount of authority and power for themselves. So if there's any future transition, the issue of the role of the military will have to be addressed, that there will have to be some vision for sidelining the military and making sure that they're not playing a central role in politics. The other thing, too, is that the Brotherhood, as we know, made a mistake in contesting the presidency. At the time, they thought it was the right thing to do, and there's a whole set of reasons why they thought that. And they ran Mohamed Morsi as their candidate for the presidency. They won the presidency in Egypt. But knowing what we know now, that was maybe going too far, too quickly. Egypt, and specifically the Egyptian deep state, wasn't ready for a Muslim Brotherhood president. So you'll have some leaders of the Brotherhood today say that if there is an opening in Egypt in the coming years, that they will try to avoid doing the same thing, that this time they won't run for the presidency, and maybe even for an interim period, they'll avoid getting into direct politics too quickly and focus on building the religious movement and leave it up to their own members to join different political parties. So there's some interesting ideas that are being discussed internally, but I think what everyone, regardless of the internal divisions in the Egyptian Brotherhood, I think there's a real understanding that they can't repeat what they did in 2011 and 2012, because that will provoke the deep state. And there's also a question of what role will the military play in a future transition. And these are things that I think, I hope Brotherhood members and other Islamists take very seriously, because they can't afford to make the same mistakes they made back then.
Right, Shadi, the conflict or the civil war in Syria, I think, has changed the political atmosphere in the region. In many countries, domestically and also internationally, Turkey, Iran, Jordan, Lebanon, many countries were influenced, including Iraq. How that war has impacted the political reform among the governments and opposition activists in the region? Because some people might say, look at Syria. If Syria had introduced political reforms, it could have been better, like Tunisia. Or some might argue that, look, Arab Spring has really taken this country into a hell.
Yeah, and I think this contributes to a lot of the exhaustion we see in America and also in Europe and the international community. Syria because Syria went in such a dark direction and it's been so tragic, and also the refugee spillover into Europe, I think there's an exhaustion with the Middle East, because you see what's happened and you see the violence, and a lot of people say, well, hey, we gave it a try. This is what happened. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, my response would be that there was a failure on the part of the international community to not support the Syrian people. But putting that aside for a moment, I think that there's a lot here in the US, for example, and I'm in Washington, D.C. right now. I think that people are tired of the Middle East because they had a lot of hope. There was optimism. And I'm not just talking about people who follow politics closely. Ordinary Americans were following these images of protest 24 hours. This was covered as the major news story in those first couple months. And I think for the first time, a lot of Americans looked to the Middle East and they said, look, they seem to want freedom just like the freedom that we have here in the US. And maybe that was a simplified narrative, but I think there was a kind of empathy and understanding and hope that a lot of Americans felt. But then they saw what happened, and then they saw the violence. And that's where Syria, I think, really figures in as a cautionary tale, but also Libya. Like, the predominant narrative right now in Washington is that the Libyan intervention was a failure, and maybe we shouldn't have intervened against Gaddafi in the first place. That's not my view, and I've been one of the few people who have said, no, the intervention was the right thing to do because we prevented an impending massacre from happening. Gaddafi's forces were marching towards Benghazi, and would we have been comfortable staying back and letting a potential massacre? That right after Gaddafi was done, the international community forgot about Libya, and we left Libya to its own devices. So I think one lesson there is that if you're going to intervene, you don't have to have, no one's calling for an occupation. No one's calling for doing Iraq like we did in the 2000s under the Bush administration, but there has to be some international engagement. We can't just forget about countries after there is a transition and after there's a new government. But is there a willingness to learn those lessons and to think about them? I don't know. And I think that if certainly the Trump administration has paid almost no attention to Libya, a Biden administration is not likely to focus a lot of attention on Libya. And I think a lot of people see Syria as a lost cause, that Assad has already effectively won the war. What can we do? So I think we're entering into a phase where there's a lot of hopelessness. There's not a clear sense of what Americans can do to help in these conflict situations, because part of it, we're exhausted, and we also have COVID, the pandemic. So there's less attention to international issues as there might have been, say, a year ago.
Shadi, we covered many issues, but there is one remaining question that I would like to raise with you. I am not going to ask you to prophesize, of course. I mean, you are not such a person. You you look at the data, etc., and then talk. But when you also mentioned about the COVID-19, and that has additional impact on the economy of the many countries, of course, including most of the authoritarian countries in the Middle East. And also the other conditions remain the same. I mean, the authoritarianism, lack of transparency, accountability, political representation. How far do you think these countries can, let's say, remain as they are? Because the conditions are not really very, not in favor of the ruling, I think, governments. If you look at the data, as you have said, during the Arab Spring, the gap between haves and have-nots have increased. I think there is a similar picture. And what is your guess for the future?
Yeah, so I think that things will only get worse in the coming years because the economic recession that we've seen globally is going to have an impact on the bottom line of these governments. I mean, tourism has almost gone down to zero in many of these countries, and especially in Egypt, but also in a number of other countries. There is quite a reliance on income from the tourism industry. That's just one example. We've seen how much oil prices have declined, and that hurts the bottom line and budgets of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others. So the budget crunch is only going to get worse. There's also new threats that we don't talk a lot about in the context of the Middle East, like the long-term effects of climate change and drought and a whole list of things. So we're not paying attention to those things because everyone's focused on addressing the short-term impacts of COVID. But on the basic economic indicators, there's very little reason to think that there will be an improvement anytime soon. And it's also unlikely that we'll return to previous levels of tourism in the coming years. I mean, there will be lag time effects even after there's a vaccine and after there's the post-COVID era. It'll take time for tourism to really recover because people are not going to be traveling overnight and getting back to their normal patterns. So all of this means that the economic pressures are going to be worse. But as you mentioned, the political conditions are just as bad and they might get worse as well. So none of this is looking very positive. So I would hope that there can be real foresight about how the international community can help in these ways and to actually do something and have a Middle East strategy. And I think there is some reason to believe that a Biden administration would be more engaged on certain things. The Yemen war, for example, on putting more pressure on Saudi Arabia, maybe suspending arms sales. These are all things that folks in the Biden camp have been discussing. But, you know, the Middle East still matters. And I think one lesson we learned from the Syrian civil war is that what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East, that there are spillover effects that affect Europe, certainly, and we saw that with the refugee crisis. But there's also other spillover effects when it comes to terrorism, violent extremism, and on a very basic level, civil war is not something that I think the international community wants to see more of in the Middle East. So there's also an interest in trying to resolve the Libyan civil war and the Yemeni civil war.
Well, Shadi, thank you very much for joining us today at the TRT World Forum Digital Debates. We have looked at the legacy of the Arab Spring in the last 10 years. And we come to the end of our debate. Hopefully, we will see you in the next debate on TRT World Forum. Goodbye to everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.